When J.D. Vance walked down a busy street in Cincinnati, no one paid much attention to the best-selling author and U.S. Senator. That's when a struggling young artist caught his eye, a 16-year-old girl selling paintings to pay for her chemotherapy. Most people passed by without a second glance, but J.D. stopped, listened, and did something that left everyone speechless. Because in true J.D. Vance style, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her life forever. And what happened next became an unforgettable story of resilience, generosity, and the power of a single act of kindness that shook the internet. The hospital room was always too cold. The sharp scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the steady beeping of machines just down the hall. Laura Johnson sat on the exam table, her hands curled into fists in her lap. She already knew what the doctor was going to say. Her mother sat beside her, silent, gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her father stood near the window, staring out at the gray Cincinnati skyline. When the doctor finally spoke, his words were gentle, but they landed like a punch to the gut. "The treatment is working," he said, "but we need to continue with at least 2 more rounds of chemotherapy." Laura barely reacted. She had been living this nightmare for almost a year now. The treatments, the sickness, the exhaustion, it was all routine. But what wasn't routine was what he said next. "I understand your insurance has reached its limit. The next round of treatment will have to be paid out of pocket." He sighed, hesitating before adding, "I know this is a difficult situation." Difficult was an understatement. The ride home was silent. Her mother's lips were pressed into a thin line, her father's eyes dark with worry. Laura didn't need to ask how much money they had left. The hospital bills had drained them long ago, their savings were gone, and now she was running out of time. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not sadness, not fear, determination. She refused to watch her parents break themselves trying to save her. If she was going to fight, she needed to do something about it. And that's when it hit her. Article. It had always been her escape, her way of capturing the emotions she couldn't put into words. If she could create something that people wanted to buy, maybe, just maybe, she could help. By morning, her decision was made. She wasn't going to sit around waiting for a miracle. She was going to paint one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush glided across the canvas, leaving behind a burst of deep blue, then a streak of orange, blending together into something new, something alive. Laura sat on a small, foldable stool, her art stand set up on a bustling sidewalk in downtown Cincinnati. The wooden table in front of her was covered with neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her soul. Her mother had helped her set up that morning, but now she was on her own. This had been her idea, her fight. If she was going to raise the money she needed, she had to do this herself. She had spent the last week pouring every ounce of energy into her paintings, even when the chemo left her too weak to hold a brush for long. Because this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. But hope was fragile. People walked past, some glancing at her stand with fleeting curiosity before moving on. A woman in a gray blazer slowed for a second, admiring a canvas, then shook her head and walked away. A businessman glanced at her sign, original artwork, raising money for chemo, but barely acknowledged it before rushing off. Laura tried not to let it get to her. She reached for her water bottle, her fingers trembling slightly as she took a sip. The summer heat pressed down on her, making her dizzy, but she would not let exhaustion win. Because somewhere in this city, there had to be someone who would see her. A young man wearing headphones walked by, barely noticing her. A couple strolled past, pausing briefly before whispering to each other and moving on. The rejection stung more than she wanted to admit. And then finally, someone stopped. An elderly woman with soft gray curls and kind eyes stepped forward, her gaze landing on a painting of a golden sunset over rolling hills. "This is beautiful," she murmured, lightly tracing the edge of the canvas. Laura swallowed hard. "It's $80, she said, forcing a smile. The woman looked at her, then at the sign. A quiet understanding flickered in her eyes. Without hesitation, she pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Keep the change," she said softly. For a second, Laura just sat there, stunned. Then, as she carefully packed the painting into a paper bag, something cracked open inside her. The first sale. The first victory. She wasn't just a girl with cancer anymore, she was an artist, and she was going to keep fighting. The city moved fast. People rushed past Laura's stand, eyes locked on their phones, conversations clipped and hurried. The sounds of honking cars and distant street musicians blended into a steady hum, a rhythm that didn't slow for anyone. Not even a 16-year-old girl trying to sell her art to stay alive. She adjusted her sign, making sure the words, "Original artwork, raising money for chemo," were visible. It had taken her an embarrassing amount of time to write it out neatly, her hands still shaky from the last round of treatment. She forced a smile as a woman in a navy dress paused to look at one of her paintings. A twilight skyline, the colors melting into each other like a dream. For a second, hope flared in Laura's chest. Then, the woman sighed. "These are really lovely," she murmured. "I wish I could, but I don't have cash on me." Laura nodded politely. "That's okay, thanks for looking." The woman gave her a sad smile before walking away. This happened again and again. A man in a business suit stopped long enough to glance at the price tags before shaking his head and moving on. A group of teenagers whispered to each other, one girl nudging her friend and giggling before they walked past. Some people didn't even look at her at all. By mid-afternoon, the sun pressed heavy against her skin, making the sidewalk shimmer. Sweat clung to her neck, and her arms felt like lead. She hadn't expected it to be this hard. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay upright. Her mother had offered to help today, but Laura had insisted on doing this herself. If she couldn't even sit at a table and sell her work, what was the point of fighting at all? Number. She refused to think like that. She reached for her water bottle, gripping it tightly as she took a small sip. She was tired, she was sore, and she was scared, but she wasn't giving up. Somewhere in the city, someone would see her. She just had to keep going. The shadows stretched long across the sidewalk as the afternoon dragged on. Laura had lost count of how many people had walked past. Her body ached from sitting on the metal stool for hours, but she kept adjusting her paintings, shifting them slightly in case a new angle caught someone's eye. And then finally, someone stopped. An elderly woman with soft gray curls and warm, curious eyes approached the stand, her cane tapping gently against the pavement. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't glancing at her phone or scanning the street for something better. She was looking at the art. Her fingers hovered over a small canvas, a sunset over a river, the sky painted in soft golds and fiery oranges, the water reflecting the fading light. "This one," the woman said, her voice gentle. "What's the story behind it?" Laura blinked, caught off guard. Most people had only asked for prices, not stories. She hesitated, then ran a thumb over the edge of the canvas. "I painted it on a day when the pain was really bad," she admitted. "I couldn't move much, so I just imagined a place where everything was warm and calm, somewhere safe." The woman's expression softened. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Laura swallowed, suddenly nervous. "It's $80. The woman reached into her purse. Without a second thought, she pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it gently on the table. "Keep the change," she said. Laura stared at the money, her fingers frozen in midair. "No arguments," the woman said, smiling. "Keep fighting, sweetheart." Laura barely managed to whisper, "Thank you." As she carefully wrapped the painting in brown paper, something inside her shifted. The exhaustion, the doubt, the fear, it all faded just for a moment. Because she wasn't just selling art anymore, She was fighting back. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the city. Laura was exhausted. The long hours sitting at her art stand, the relentless heat, and the ever-present fatigue from her treatments had drained her. But she wasn't leaving yet. She had sold only one painting all day. She adjusted her sign for what felt like the 100th time, "Selling art to save my life." The words felt heavy, too raw, too real, but this was her reality. Across the street, a man holding a camera slung over his shoulder paused mid-step. He wasn't like the other passers-by who barely glanced at her stand before moving on. He was watching. A few moments later, he crossed the street. "Hey there," he said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Jake Monroe, a writer for the Cincinnati Post. I cover local artists." Laura blinked, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. A reporter? Here? Talking to her? "Would it be okay if I take some pictures of your work?" he asked. "And maybe hear a little about why you're out here?" Laura hesitated. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she nodded, swallowing back the nerves. As Jake snapped a few photos, he asked about her paintings, about how long she had been an artist. And then, gently, he asked, "What made you start selling them here?" Laura exhaled slowly. She had told her story before, to doctors, to family friends, to strangers who offered kind but fleeting words. But this time felt different. "I have leukemia," she said, her voice steady. "My insurance won't cover my next round of chemo, and my family is drowning in medical bills. So I'm doing the only thing I know how to do, painting." Jake's expression didn't shift to pity. Instead, there was something else there. Admiration. "That's incredible," he said. He jotted down notes, asking a few more questions before finally tucking his notebook away. "I'll write up your story tonight," he told her. "People need to hear this." Laura wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe a few people would read it, maybe nothing would change. But she had no idea how much everything was about to shift. The next morning, Laura arrived at her usual spot and set up her paintings like always. The city bustled around her, the morning rush of coffee seekers and business professionals filling the sidewalks. Then, something strange happened. A woman stopped in front of her stand, not just to glance, but to really look at her paintings. "You're the girl from the article," she said. Laura's breath caught. "You read it?" The woman smiled, nodding. "I saw it last night. Your story is incredible. I want to buy something." Laura barely had time to respond before the woman picked out a painting, one of her favorites, a quiet night sky filled with soft blues and purples. "How much?" $80, Laura said automatically. The woman handed her a $100 bill without hesitation. "Keep the change," she said. Laura was still processing the moment when two more people approached, holding up their phones. "I read about you online," a young man said. "Are these all yours?" "Yes," Laura said, still half in shock. "I'll take 3, he said. 3? For the first time since she started this, Laura felt hope ignite in her chest. More people arrived throughout the day, some buying paintings, some just donating money, pressing bills into her hands with soft words of encouragement. An older woman shook her head as she tucked a 20 into the jar. "You shouldn't have to fight for your life like this," she murmured. Laura swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. By the end of the day, her donation jar was overflowing, and nearly half her paintings were gone. She packed up with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. Maybe she could actually do this. The steady flow of customers had given Laura something she hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. People were stopping. People were listening. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, this crazy idea could actually work. And then he showed up. She saw him before he even reached the stand, a businessman in a crisp navy suit, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk. He walked with purpose, the kind of person who rarely slowed down for anything. Laura straightened as he approached, hoping he might be interested in her work. Instead, he barely glanced at her paintings before letting out a sharp scoff. "You won't make enough selling paintings," he said, shaking his head. "You need a real plan." Laura's stomach clenched. She had heard dismissive comments before, pitying glances, whispers of poor girl, people who thought she was just a charity case. But this was different. This wasn't pity. This was doubt. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "This is my plan," she said, "and I'm not giving up." The businessman smirked, like she was naive for even trying. "Well, good luck with that." And just like that, he walked away. Laura clenched her jaw, staring at the ground, willing the heat in her cheeks to fade. She didn't notice the woman standing a few feet away, phone raised, recording the entire exchange. The video hit Twitter within minutes. A teen battling cancer is selling her art to afford chemo, and this guy told her she needed a real plan. Let's prove him wrong. By the time Laura closed up her stand that evening, she had no idea that a storm was already brewing online. People were furious. The video was spreading fast, gaining thousands of views by the hour. And among the many eyes watching, one pair belonged to J.D. Vance. The next day, the crowd at Laura's stand was bigger than ever. More people had seen the article. More people had watched the video. More people wanted to help. Laura barely had time to process it all. The morning had been a whirlwind. People buying paintings, slipping money into her donation jar, even some offering to commission pieces. She was busy carefully wrapping a painting for a woman when she felt it. A presence, not the hurried energy of a customer, not the casual glance of a passerby. Someone was watching her. She looked up. A tall man stood a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. His button-down shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his expression was thoughtful, not pitying, not dismissive, just curious. He wasn't holding up a phone. He wasn't recording her. He was studying her work. Laura's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his eyes landing on a particular painting, an Appalachian landscape bathed in golden light, rolling hills stretching endlessly under a wide, open sky. Slowly, he reached out and ran his fingers over the textured strokes. Laura swallowed. "That's one of my favorites," she said quietly. The man finally looked at her. His blue eyes were sharp, focused, like someone who had spent a lifetime reading between the lines. "You paint these yourself?" "Yes," she said, gripping the edge of the table to keep her hands steady. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "They're damn good." Laura's breath hitched. Because she recognized him now, J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, a U.S. senator, a man who had built his entire career on defying the odds. And now, he was standing in front of her, holding one of her paintings. She had no idea what was about to happen next, but it was going to change everything. J.D. Vance turned the painting over in his hands, studying every brushstroke. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't glancing at his phone or half listening while waiting for his coffee order. He was present, truly looking at her work like it meant something. Laura felt small under his gaze, but not in a bad way. Not like the businessman who had brushed her off. This was different. Finally, J.D. lifted his head, locking eyes with her. "Why do you paint?" The question was so simple, yet it struck something deep inside her. Laura exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her jeans. She had never had to explain it before. Not like this. Not to someone who might actually care about the answer. She glanced down at the painting in his hands, the golden Appalachian hills, the endless sky. "I paint because I have to," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's the one thing cancer hasn't taken from me." J.D.'s expression didn't change, but his grip on the painting tightened slightly. "When I'm too tired to get out of bed, I can still paint," she continued. "When I feel like my body's giving up on me, I can still create something. It makes me feel like I still have control over something." She hesitated, then added, "And if I can sell them, maybe I can stay alive long enough to paint a lot more." The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. JD was silent for a long moment. He looked down at the painting again, running his fingers over the ridges of paint. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket. Laura's breath hitched as he pulled out a wallet. For a moment, she expected him to grab some cash, maybe hand her a $100 bill like some of the others had, and that would have been enough. But instead, J.D. Vance did something that would change everything. J.D. didn't pull out cash, he pulled out a checkbook. Laura's stomach flipped. A few people in the growing crowd gasped quietly, realizing what was happening. Others stopped in their tracks, phones already raised, capturing the moment. J.D. flipped the checkbook open, pulled out a pen, and without hesitation, started writing. Laura's heart pounded so hard, she thought she might pass out. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. She tried to keep breathing, watching as he scribbled down the numbers. And then, J.D. tore the check from the book and handed it to her. Laura stared at it, her brain refusing to process what she was seeing. $50,000. Her hands trembled violently as she slowly lifted her eyes to J.D. This can't be real. J.D. smirked slightly, tucking his checkbook back into his jacket. It's real. Her vision blurred, her throat tightened. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman let out a sharp sob, Laura's mother. Laura turned just in time to see her pushing through the people gathered around the stand, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. J.D. glanced at her, then back at Laura. That enough to cover your treatment? Laura couldn't even speak. She nodded rapidly, unable to hold back the tears threatening to spill. J.D. reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice quieter now. You keep painting, he said, and you keep fighting. And with that, he turned and walked away. But the moment wasn't over. Because the second J.D. disappeared into the crowd, the real frenzy began. For a moment, everything was still. Laura stared at the check in her trembling hands, unable to process what had just happened. $50,000, enough to cover her chemo, enough to save her life. And then, chaos. Someone in the crowd gasped. Did that really just happen? A woman clutched her husband's arm. Was that J.D. Vance? The murmurs turned into shouts. Phones shot up in every direction. Some people were already recording, whispering in disbelief as they filmed Laura still frozen in shock, the check clutched between her fingers. A young man in a flannel shirt turned to his friend. I don't even need a painting, I just want to help. He stepped forward and dropped a $100 bill into Laura's donation jar. And then, like dominoes, more people followed. A woman handed Laura 2 crisp 20s. For your treatment, sweetheart. A businessman, possibly even the same one who had doubted her days earlier, reached into his wallet and pulled out $500, tucking it under the jar with a quiet nod. Laura's brain was spinning. Was this real? A young mother holding a toddler in her arms stepped forward. I read your story online this morning, she said, eyes glistening with tears. You remind me of my little sister. She fought like you. I want this one. She picked up a painting, a soft watercolor of a quiet lake at sunrise. How much? 80, Laura managed to whisper. The woman handed her $300. Keep the change. More people pushed forward, not wanting paintings, but wanting to give. Some grabbed whatever art was left. Some just pressed money into her mother's hands, their voices breaking as they told Laura to keep fighting. She barely had time to react. Her hands moved on instinct, wrapping up paintings, accepting donations, muttering, "Thank you," over and over. Within 20 minutes, every single painting was gone. Her donation jar, once nearly empty, was stuffed with cash, checks, and handwritten notes of encouragement. She had started the morning hoping to sell maybe 1 or 2 pieces. Now, she had more than she ever could have dreamed of, and she had no idea that this was just the beginning. Because overnight, her story was about to explode. Laura barely slept, not just because of the adrenaline still rushing through her veins, but because her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. By the time she finally crashed into bed that night, J.D. Vance's act of kindness was already making waves, but she had no idea how far it would go. It wasn't just a local story anymore. Somewhere, someone had uploaded the video, the moment J.D. handed her the check, the crowd's reaction, the flood of donations, and it was spreading like wildfire. By midnight, it had racked up hundreds of thousands of views on Twitter. By morning, that number had jumped to over 1 million. She groggily reached for her phone, blinking at the sheer avalanche of notifications flooding her screen. Her best friend Rachel had sent her a string of texts in all caps. "Laura, check Twitter. Holy freaking crap." Laura's stomach twisted as she tapped the link. The first thing she saw was the headline pinned to the top of Twitter's trending page. J.D. Vance changes a girl's life with one unbelievable gesture. Beneath it, the video had exploded past 5 million views. Her heart pounded as she scrolled. Celebrities were retweeting the video, commenting on her strength, tagging each other with messages like, "This girl is incredible. Let's help her." Laura covered her mouth with her hand, trying to breathe. And then she saw the email. Subject, Gallery Inquiry, the Davidson Art Collective, NYC. Laura's hands shook as she clicked it open. "Dear Laura, we came across your story and were deeply moved by your work and your resilience. We would love to offer you a place in our upcoming exhibit and potentially a solo show in the near future. Please let us know if you'd be interested." She dropped her phone. A gallery in New York? A solo exhibition? Her mom was at the kitchen table, scrolling through her own phone, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Laura," she whispered, looking up, "you're everywhere." Laura wasn't just a girl selling art anymore. She was an artist, and the whole world was watching. The hospital room felt different this time. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like a place of dread. Laura sat in the reclining chair, the IV drip slowly delivering the chemotherapy into her veins. She could hear the quiet beeping of monitors, the hushed conversations of nurses outside the door. But she wasn't drowning in anxiety, because this time there was hope. She looked over at her mother, who was flipping through a magazine, trying and failing to act calm. But Laura could see it, the weight that had been lifted. For months, her parents had been suffocating under the weight of impossible choices: which bills to pay, how to keep the lights on, how to save their daughter's life. Now they didn't have to choose. J.D. Vance's check, the donations from strangers, the support from people across the country, they had saved her. Laura exhaled and glanced down at her phone. She had received hundreds of messages from people who had seen her story. Some were fellow cancer patients, others were struggling artists. Some were complete strangers who had been moved by what happened that day on the sidewalk. One message stood out. A little girl named Maggie, who was also fighting leukemia, had sent Laura a picture of a crayon drawing. "I want to be an artist like you when I get better. Do you think I can?" Laura's throat tightened. She typed back quickly, "Of course you can. You're already an artist." The nurse entered the room with a warm smile. "You're looking better today, Laura." Laura nodded. She felt better. She was still sick. She still had battles ahead. But now she had a future. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked in between the usual stack of bills and junk mail. A handwritten letter addressed to Laura Johnson. She nearly dropped the envelope when she saw the sender's name in the corner, J.D. Vance. Her hands trembled as she carefully opened it, unfolding the thick stationery. The writing was strong and steady, written in bold, slanted letters. "Laura, I meant what I said. Your paintings are damn good. But more than that, your story matters. The world needs more artists like you, more people who fight for something, who create even when things seem impossible. I hope you keep painting. I hope you keep inspiring people. But most of all, I hope you never forget that what you did, what you're doing, matters. Keep creating, keep fighting. J.D. Vance. Laura swallowed the lump in her throat. She read it again and again. Then, without hesitation, she walked over to her desk, grabbed a simple black frame, and carefully placed the letter inside. She set it next to her paints, where she would see it every single day. Because the day J.D. Vance stopped at her art stand, it didn't just save her life, it changed it forever. 1 year later, everything had changed. Laura Johnson stood in the middle of a bright, bustling art gallery in New York City, surrounded by people admiring her work. Her work. She had dreamed of this moment, but never imagined it would happen so soon. The walls were lined with her paintings, vibrant landscapes, quiet cityscapes, and deeply personal abstract pieces, all telling a story of survival, hope, and resilience. A small plaque beneath each one read, "Laura Johnson, artist, survivor, fighter." She smoothed out the fabric of her dress, still getting used to events like this. The past year had been a whirlwind: radio interviews, TV segments, art showcases across the country, but none of that compared to what mattered most. Her nonprofit, the Laura Johnson Foundation, was officially up and running. Through donations and partnerships, she had helped fund art therapy programs in pediatric cancer hospitals across the country, giving young patients a creative outlet, a way to express their fear, their hope, their fight, just like she had. A soft chime from her phone made her glance down. It was a text from her mom. "Turn on the news. You're going to want to see this." Frowning, Laura stepped away from the gallery crowd and pulled up the live stream of a press conference from Washington, D.C. The camera focused on J.D. Vance, standing in his office. Behind him, among framed photos and bookshelves, hung a familiar painting, her painting. The Appalachian landscape, the one he had picked up that day, the one that started everything. A reporter asked about it. J.D. turned slightly, looking at the artwork before facing the cameras again. "This painting isn't just a decoration," he said, his voice steady. "It's a reminder of resilience, of hope, of what can happen when people believe in each other." Laura's chest tightened. J.D. Vance, a man who had built his career on overcoming impossible odds, had kept her painting hanging in his office. A symbol of one moment, one choice, one act of kindness that had changed 2 lives forever. Laura exhaled, blinking back tears. She had survived. She had fought. And now she was giving back. Because this was more than just a painting. It was proof that hope, no matter how small, could change the world. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more brutal.